Hip thrusting 101. Hip thrusts are one of the best, most underutilized exercises out there, in my personal opinion. And one of the main reasons why they're underutilized is two things. One, setup can be difficult. So I'm going to go through multiple different setup types to get you hip thrusting comfortably. And two, it's a little bit of an awkward movement. And I remember the first time I kind of learned about the hip thrust, learned about its benefits, and went to implement it with a client. I was actually fairly nervous implementing it with that client or any client because the movement looked so different, but nobody was using the hip thrust in the gym at the time. And this was probably about 10 years ago. But since that time, hip thrusts have become way more common. You shouldn't have any issues. It will take maybe your first few times doing them, if you are in a public setting, a little bit to build up that confidence. To know that, there's nothing weird about hip thrusting, so to speak. But with that said, the benefits of the hip thrust are endless. And in my experience, those who get stronger at hip thrust will not only see the aesthetic gains that they want to see, they'll build bulletproof lower backs. It also really helps with your knees as your glutes get stronger and stronger. And there are tons and tons of aesthetic benefits to hip thrusting. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about different setups to hip thrust. Obviously, we'll go through form and technique, the major points to that, and then we'll talk about different hip thrust variations, progressions, and numbers in terms of goals and reaching different levels from just starting out to beginner to advanced to really elite hip thrusting. So first things first, most people will have a riser at home. With a riser, if you have one like this that stacks up, it could be a great tool to set up on hip thrust. You're going to see my bench here is a little bit higher. Now this is, I would say, an abnormally high bench. The two things that you want to ensure with your hip thrust, and the nice thing about having the riser here, is that your torso is parallel to the floor. So you don't want to have a bench that's too high where your torso isn't parallel, because then it can be harder to get full posterior pelvic tilt with your hips and get your glutes to activate maximally. And also too, it can be harder to get in and out of your hip thrust if your bench is too high. If you have a riser like this, ideally it's going to stack up either 4, 5, or 6 high. 6 high would be if you're about 6 feet plus. 5 high is in that mid 5 range, maybe a little higher 5 foot range. And then 4 risers high would be if you're in that high 4 foot range, 5 foot or low 5 foot range. Again, and that's just based on keeping that torso parallel. With that being said, if you have a standard riser setup, you just want to make sure that it's high enough, as much as you don't want to be downward like this with your torso. You don't want to be upward like this, because it can definitely promote further hip extension. So we'll do the riser first. I'm going to talk about setup. So with my setup for my hip thrust, tends to be a little different for everyone. What I get clients to do is to play with their foot positioning to find what helps them to contract their glutes the best. So one of the things I've noticed through watching videos of myself hip thrusting and correcting my technique, or looking at my technique, is I tend to have my feet a little bit further away. But that ideal setup is going to be head facing forward, glutes are on strong, hips are completely in posterior pelvic tilt. The reason why my head is facing forward, this is key and essential, is because as soon as I lean my head back, you see my ribs flare. As soon as my ribs flare up, I'm more prone to extension. And with our hip thrust, we really want to make sure we have no spinal extension whatsoever, nice neutral spine, glutes are squeezing nice and strong, and then we're around 90 degrees at the knee. Now again, it doesn't have to be 90. Like I said, I tend to have my feet out a little bit more, and I'll drive like that, and I tend to be able to feel my glutes engage a little bit more as I do so. You don't want to have your feet too close. What that's going to do is it's going to activate your quads too much. They won't be able to stretch out, and you won't be able to get enough of a glute contraction. If your feet are out too far, the issue is going to be hamstring dominance. Your hamstrings are going to fire more than your glutes. So there is a bit of wiggle room there, but again, you don't want to be too far out, too much hamstrings, you don't want to be too close, too much quad. So play with it. Another thing you can play with as well is having your feet either flat, or you can have your heels up. Myself personally, I find if I drive through my heels more and keep my toes up, I can really get those glutes to fire nice and strong. I can still get them to fire with my feet flat as well, but I do find that they fire a little bit better if I have just my heels digging down. And then in terms of my feet, you can keep them straight. You can externally rotate them just a little bit to get your outer glutes to fire a little bit more. So glute medius and glute minimus, like so. A little bit of drive with that extra external rotation at the hips. Again, it's all playing around, finding that personal preference. But the main things with form, keep your head facing forward, place 1 or 2 hands behind your head if your neck gets sore. Make sure your glutes are firing through, posterior pelvic tilt. Make sure that lower back is nice and flat. And then again, pick and choose your foot positioning accordingly. So getting in and out of the hip thrust, whether you're on a riser or whether you're on a bench, if you're using a dumbbell, what I prefer clients do, and I grab my biggest, heaviest dumbbell just to show you that it can be done basically at any weight, but you want to do it as safely and efficiently as possible. So regardless of how big the dumbbell is, start with it in between your legs, and then from here you can either lift it or roll it onto your hips, and then I'm going to drive up, and with that I keep the dumbbell right on my hips. I'm going to dip down, drive up and squeeze nice and strong. Dip down, drive up and squeeze nice and strong, and then when I'm done, legs come down, and I roll that dumbbell away, just like so. That is the safest way. One of the things I don't like to see clients do is where they twist and they rotate. Rotation, especially under load, is one of the hardest things on your spine, hardest things for your lower back. So you always want to place that dumbbell in the middle and then drive it up. Now from there, we're going to get into barbell hip thrusting variations. And with my barbell hip thrust, same thing, riser can be used, no problem. The biggest challenge with the barbell hip thrust is getting that bar over our hips. So you're gonna notice here, I have these 10-pound bumper plates, and these can be a game changer if you're looking to up your hip thrust game, particularly with a barbell. The other thing that I highly, highly recommend is using a squat sponge. So you can typically find these for anywhere from $25 to $35, usually on Amazon, and they'll be a huge help to making sure that your hips are comfortable as you perform hip thrusts and as you start to increase your weights. And then with that being said, the reason why the 10-pound bumper plates are so great is because I can roll that bar right over my thighs. From here, I'm going to dig my feet in, get them as close to my butt as I can. I'll adjust them at the top if need be. And then same things apply in terms of technique. Head stays forward. I'm going to drive. I also, particularly if I'm doing barbell hip thrusts, I'll tend to engage and squeeze my core just to help brace my spine a little bit as I come up. I come up with that squeeze, down to the bottom, drive up with that squeeze, down to the bottom, drive up with that squeeze, down to the bottom, just like so. Now again, the 10-pound bumper plates are a huge game changer because they'll make it really easy to roll that bar on and off. And then the other thing is they also make it easier to stack up and load those other plates. And plates and weights tend to work off of cost per pound. So these are a really good, cheap option that will be an absolute game changer. One of the other game changers is the bigger plates with the wider diameter are 45 pounds usually. And that's sort of a big milestone in terms of hip thrusting, because if you can get to 45 pounds on each side and then you have a barbell that's 45 pounds, 135 pounds, that's that big first milestone with barbell hip thrusting, and it's so great because then you can just roll that bar on and roll that bar off with those bigger diameter plates. If you're not quite there yet and you have to use smaller barbells or smaller plates with diameters, you have two options. So one of the things I used to do is we would have our riser here, and then we'd stack another riser here and another riser here. And let's say I had 25-pound plates on each side, or even 10-pound plates. I just roll it on, get it over my top, over the top of my hips, and drive up and down. If you don't have access to other risers, the other thing that we would do is stack up plates. So I put like two 25-pound plates here, two 25-pound plates here, get that barbell in place and drive up. And then the other option would be to perform your barbells hip thrusts out of a squat rack and have those safety pins set up accordingly, which I'm going to show you next. All right, this is not necessarily the best setup. With a bigger squat rack, you would have safety pins where you can put the bar, let's say on the bottom here, and then there would be another, and then you would just go in, you could set up your riser or your bench. But ultimately what you're doing is you're just creating enough space to be able to get under the bar. The other thing that works really well is a Smith machine. So the Smith machine is where the barbell is attached. You just pull those hooks off. Biggest thing with the Smith machine is you want to make sure you're going all the way up and down for proper range of motion. But I've had many clients tell me that is their preferred way of hip thrusting with a barbell at the gym, where they just load up plates and go with it. Now from here, I'm able to get my legs under nicely. I'm going to prop that up. I'm going to get into my position, and then I'm going to go down for my hip thrust, come up, squeeze. Go down, we want that full range of motion. Come up, squeeze, down, full range of motion. Come up, squeeze. When you're done, you just bring that barbell back like so. You rest and then you repeat for the amount of rounds prescribed, amount of reps prescribed. With that being said, this can work well. The other thing that sometimes works well too with a setup like this is where you have your bench on a decline. If you do have that higher bench because you don't have access to the riser, because oftentimes squat racks are set up with a certain type of bench. If it's too high, just set it on a decline. You set this in, you go in and out, you get all your hip thrusting done, and then once you're done, you can pop the plates off, whatever it might be, and hop out of the squat rack. Now, the gold standard for hip thrust would be the hip thruster, which is an actual bench setup for hip thrust specifically. Absolutely love this machine. I've had it for 5 years, and I've had several, dozens and dozens of clients perform hip thrusts 4 reps with over 200 pounds, over 300 pounds, over 400 pounds, and one of my clients actually reached 500 pounds. Her name is Lauren, super strong and dedicated to her strength training. One of the reasons why I love hip thrusting so much is for that reason, is the unlimited strength potential with this exercise. The other thing I love about it is very hard to hurt yourself with hip thrust. The biggest thing that you want to avoid is overextension. So as you come up, you got to make sure your glutes are strong enough for the weights that you're using, and you can see that proper posterior pelvic tilt. So long as you avoid that overextension, you shouldn't have any issues. And as I mentioned, progressive overload over time, sky's the limit. The other reason why I love hip thrust so much, or hip thrusting variations, is because there is an ample amount of different variations to help to maximize your glute gains and ultimately strength gains. And then lastly, one of the other reasons why I love hip thrust so much is because getting stronger at hip thrust in this exercise, and I noticed this with my own personal training with a lot of my clients, the stronger I got at this exercise, the better I got at squatting, the better I got at deadlifting, the safer those exercises became, the better I felt when doing them, and ultimately making me stronger and leaner, all thanks to getting stronger through my glutes using hip thrust. So we'll go through some of the different variations. As I mentioned, progression-wise, dumbbells, I typically don't have clients go over 100 pounds with a dumbbell just because it's too big and too bulky at that point. And you definitely want them doing barbells before they would even get to that point. But dumbbells up to 50 is great, and I've had clients use 60 and even 70 pounds. But if they're doing that, then they're definitely doing barbells. With barbells, we've got a combination of lower rep sets, medium rep sets, so that 8 to 12 range, and then higher rep sets. With my hip thruster, just simply roll it on. I have my little mats here to prop the plates up, tuck my feet in. Notice how my butt is a little bit lower than where my feet are, so that allows me to get them closer for a better initial setup. Keep that head forward, drive and squeeze the glutes, come down, pause. Drive and squeeze the glutes, come down, pause. Drive and squeeze the glutes, come down, pause, and then I roll away. You can do barbell hip thrust with isometric holds at the top, or any hip thrust variation. Isometric holds at the top, great for enhancing your mind-muscle connection, great for getting a good solid burn. You could do eccentric to cause a little bit more muscle damage, ultimately trying to enhance growth. So with my eccentric, I drive up and then it's controlled down. I feel my glutes stretching out, and then I squeeze up nice and strong. Then you got single leg hip thrust, driving up, down, driving up, down. Those I don't tend to do with a barbell. They're hard enough with even just a dumbbell. I would drape that dumbbell over my hip. Single leg hip thrust. You've got B-stance hip thrust. These ones I actually will do with a barbell, where they're kind of like a little bit of an assisted single leg hip thrust. I tend to like them a little bit more than single leg hip thrust, but I do use both variations, where you're driving up and I'm just focusing on my right leg. My left leg is giving about 10-20% of the help, but my right leg is doing 80 to 90%, and then you switch part of the way through. And then you got banded hip thrust. So we got our looped bands, where we can add it around our knees. So our glutes are responsible for good posterior pelvic tilt and hip extension, but our side glutes, that median min I talked about earlier, they're responsible for external rotation. So this loop will place force internally on our knees, and we'll have to use our glutes a little bit harder. So you just place that band. People ask me all the time, above the knees, below the knees. Really depends on the exercise, but typically for barbell stuff, I'll go above the knees like so, down, drive up, you can use these for dumbbells as well, and you can use them just for body weight. And then you also have banded hip thrust. This is one of the best parts about the hip thruster. I love banded hip thrust. If I've ever had clients who have had lower back injuries, before I start them with a barbell, I'll start them with banded hip thrust first, just to ensure. I'll tell you why in a second. I've also had clients come back from hip surgeries or hip replacements. I'll start them with bands before we ever touch a barbell. The reason being, the band will place tension at the top of your thrust like so, but then as you come down, there's no tension. So it's nice and easy on the hips when they're in this flex position, on the lower back when you're in that bottom position, and then you drive back up. It just gives tension at the top for when you want to be squeezing your glutes maximally. And then again, you can do these with the banded loop, and then banded hip thrust. You can do them with that isometric hold, you can do them eccentrically, you can do them time under tension. So all that to say, hip thrust is an amazing exercise with tons and tons of variation. Starting body weight is a great way to get your glutes going and active again, but then after that, sky's the limit in terms of potential. Work your way up with a dumbbell, upwards to 50 pounds on your hips, 4 sets of 12, sets of 15. If you get to that point, then you're probably ready to start with a barbell. Usually starting clients out with a barbell, I'll get them to do 80 pounds. Another nice thing about the bumper plates is you can have your 45-pound bar with your 10 on each side, and then you start to add plates to it. 85 pounds transitions to 100, transitions to 135 really quickly. And as mentioned, I've had dozens and dozens of clients perform 200-pound hip thrust for reps, 300-pound hip thrust for reps, just with slow and steady progressions as they go, using a combination of low rep sets, mid rep sets, and high rep sets. And always form stays the exact same. Head forward, strong through the stomach, drive the glutes right through, and make sure your feet are in that optimal position as you perform your thrusting.